And that is how my grandmother put greedy preachers in their places. Twice. Even after she died, she exposed their hypocrisy at her funeral by excluding them and having an open microphone service that everyone said was better without preachers. And then, at the reading of her will, she gave them each 1 cent, gave their church 1 cent, and gave the massive inheritance they were expecting to a black charity that her racist church had abandoned, proving that her faith was real, and theirs was only about money and power. My grandmother taught us all one final lesson. Actions speak louder than words in true Christian love. A couple of weeks later, it was time to start distributing the bequests in Grandma's will. Although Grandma and Grandpa dearly loved each other, they had separate wills. Nobody thought that my grandparents were wealthy. They had lived in the same small but charming house in a prosperous, well-maintained suburban neighborhood for the past 50-plus years, and had worked hard and lived modestly. But it was rumored that they had a very nice nest egg. The reading of the will was a tradition in our family, because it was one of those events that gave our close-knit, extended family an excuse to get together. With this family tradition in mind, many of our family members' wills often contained very personal bequests of items that had little cash value, but were the departed family members' way of telling their loved ones that they wanted to share a cherished memory with them one last time. As an added incentive to attend, the family rumor mill had been buzzing with speculation, encouraged by Grandpa that Grandma's will contained some surprises. The reading was held in a conference room at a lawyer's office. Unsurprisingly, the attendees included my mom, as well as aunts, uncles, great-aunts, great-uncles, and many of the grandchildren. We were all surprised, however, to see pompous pastor and ass pastor from Big White Church. They informed us that Grandma's lawyer had told them that Grandma's will had bequests not only for Big White Church, but also for them personally. Maybe it was just our imagination, but my siblings, cousins, and I couldn't help noticing that these preachers appeared to be actively salivating over their good fortune at Grandma's generosity. The lawyer's conference room was a bit smaller than an average middle-class living room. Extra chairs had been brought in. Every seat was filled, and people were standing in every remaining space. There was barely space for all of us. Grandma's lawyer suggested that pompous pastor and ass pastor sit in chairs which were in the front of the room, next to himself. Since there was a large table in the room, this meant that the lawyer and these two preachers were the only ones who were directly facing everyone else. Although the preachers were gratified to be physically next to the center of attention, they did not notice, as all of the rest of us quickly noticed, that these seats made it easy for everyone else in the room to watch them closely. And it made it practically impossible for them to leave the packed room before the entire meeting was over, because they were farthest from the room's single door, and there were almost 24 people standing or sitting between them and their only path to escape. The bequests were quite generous, but pretty much what we had expected. Grandpa kept their house, its contents, their retirement accounts, and everything that remained after all of the bequests had been satisfied. Children, grandchildren, and several local charities received nice, but not extravagant, amounts of money. Several sentimental items were named and given to various friends and relatives. Grandpa was the first beneficiary listed in the will. But after him, all of the other bequests were arranged in order of increasing worth. They started with sentimental items, which had very small cash value. Then each grandchild received several $1,000s. Then each son, daughter, brother, sister, niece, and nephew received a little more. Then several local nonprofits received very nice amounts. Bequests to Big White Church, pompous pastor, and ass pastor were almost the last ones listed in the will. They listened politely to the other bequests, but with steadily growing anticipation as they noticed the exponential upward trend in Grandma's generosity. When Grandma's lawyer got to the Big White Church and preacher's part of the will, he said, "This is a bit unusual. But before I announced these bequests to Big White Church, pompous pastor and ass pastor, Mrs. Grandma's name, requested that I read the following statement to everyone present. He opened a letter that was written in Grandma's own handwriting. Grandma's letter. For the past 10 years, not one person from Big White Church has ever called me, come to visit me, or sent me a note to tell me that they cared about me. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the church women, not one of the church members who I worked with for all of those years, loved dearly, and thought were my friends. I worked very hard for you when you needed me, for many, many years. But when I needed you in your church, you all pretended that I didn't exist. I only got one visit when I was dying, and I invited pompous pastor to come to my house and help me plan my funeral. This was my last attempt, after many attempts that I had made over the past 10 years, to reach out to my church and pastor, whom I still loved dearly, even though they had made it clear that they did not love me. If only I could have my funeral at my church. Maybe some of my church friends, whom I had not seen in a decade, would come to the service to see me one last time. And I know they love to hear pompous pastor preach, so if he preached at my funeral, maybe they would come to my funeral to hear him, even if they would not have come to see me. But pompous pastor couldn't find the time to visit me, or even call me to tell me whether or not he was willing to preach at my funeral. Ass pastor came by my house, but he didn't want to talk about my funeral. He just wanted me to remember his church in my will. That's all. Just remember his church in my will. It was then that I realized that I had allowed my church to break my heart for one last time. But that was the last time. The very last time. As pastor did not know it when he visited me, but Grandpa and I had already prepared my will. Long before his visit, which did include a double tithe, 20% of my entire estate, for what was now my former church, Big White Church. This amount was, here she named an enormous amount of money, generating muffled wows from many of her heirs, including me. But I got to feeling badly that we had not personally remembered such nice people as pompous pastor and ass pastor. So I changed my will to include them by name. While I was at it, I changed the amount of money that I left to Big White Church to match all of the love that they have showed to me during the last 10 years of my life, when I was suffering and lonely and no longer able to work my ass off for them for free, like I had done for almost half a century. That is her entire written statement, the lawyer said. Now let's get back to the bequests in the will. Bequest to ass pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to pompous pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Big White Church, 1 cent. The pompous pastor and ass pastor sat there, looking like someone had just injected a gallon of Novocaine into their jaws. Every one of Grandma's family and friends felt an overwhelming urge to laugh out loud. But we kept quiet because we knew Grandma. We knew she wasn't finished yet. Grandma was simply setting them up for a 1-2 punch. The best was yet to come, and we didn't want to miss it. This is a story about my grandmother, who generously served her Bible-believing Christian church for almost 50 years without asking anything in return. But when she became elderly, disabled, and homebound, her church acted like she did not exist. That is, until she was literally on her deathbed, when that church showed a sudden interest in her will. She waited until exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right audience, to expose these greedy hypocrites for what they truly were, and she did it twice. My grandmother was a member of a large conservative Bible-believing church for her entire adult life. I'll call this church Big White Church. It was located in a prosperous suburb of a large city in the Bible Belt of the Deep South. Grandma was very active in Big White Church. She worked in the nursery every Sunday morning. She helped cook hundreds of church fellowship breakfasts and dinners. She accompanied her children and grandchildren on dozens of church retreats and choir tours. She taught youth Bible study on Sunday nights and was very active in supporting missions and youth programs. She always tithed and often gave extra for special offerings. Grandma's greatest talent was making other people feel important. Although I belonged to a different church, I often visited with Grandma, and when I did, I usually went to big white church functions with her. I've seen her single-handedly cook breakfast for dozens of church youth, a task which took over 2 hours, even in the church's large kitchen. Then, after the meal, she asked the group for a round of applause for the high school student leader for doing such a great job of organizing the prayer breakfast. I remember that, on a church youth retreat at a rural camp, she drove most of the night to go back to the city and retrieve a big box of materials that one of the assistant pastors, whom I'll call Ass Pastor, had forgotten and asked her to get. She brought them back in time for the morning program the next day. His boss, the senior pastor, whom I'll call Pompous Pastor, never found out that Ass Pastor had messed up or that Grandma had fixed it for him. Ass Pastor never even thanked Grandma. Even though I was a child, this bothered me so much that I asked her about it. She said that she didn't mind at all. She told me her reward would be that those materials would help children find Jesus. Grandma's service to her church ended abruptly at the age of 73 when she broke her back in a car accident. Afterwards, for the last 10 years of her life, she was homebound and could not go to church because of this injury and declining health due to old age. Her mind was just as sharp as ever, and her faith remained sincere, but her body wore out a little more every day. During those 10 years, she made many efforts to reach out to her church, its leadership, and her church friends, inviting them to visit her at her home. Every single one of these invitations was declined or simply ignored. Not one person from Big White Church ever called her, came to visit her, or sent her a note to tell her that they cared about her. Not one minister, not one deacon, not one of the church women, not one of the church members who she had worked with for all of those years, loved dearly, and thought were her friends. Near the end, when she was in home hospice care, she decided to plan her own funeral. She and my grandpa called her church and asked for the senior pastor, Pompous Pastor, whom she had known for over 30 years, to visit her so that they could plan her memorial service. They wanted it to be held at the church. Pompous Pastor was too busy, but Ass Pastor stopped by a few days later. According to my grandpa, here's what happened at that meeting, with my grandma literally on her deathbed. Grandma, Grandpa, and Ass Pastor discussed her funeral for a couple of minutes. Then Ass Pastor started pressuring her to lay up your treasure in heaven by remembering your church in your will. Grandpa told him firmly that this is neither the time nor the place to discuss her will. They went back to discussing the funeral for a few minutes. Then Ass Pastor steered the conversation back to Grandma's will, with liberal injections of how badly her church needed her support. Grandpa told him several times that it was inappropriate to talk to Grandma about her will or the church's financial needs, because she was terminally ill and in an enormous amount of physical pain. Ass Pastor would agree and briefly talk about the funeral, but would then go back to talking about the church's financial needs, heavenly rewards, and Bible verses about treasure. My grandma started crying. To put this into context, Grandma was more than a steel magnolia. She was titanium coated with diamond wrapped in Kevlar. She rarely ever cried and never, ever cried about herself. Not one tear when the doctor told her that her back was broken so badly that she would never walk again, nor during the following 6 months in futile rehabilitation. She would shed sincere but well-managed tears at funerals and while visiting family members in the hospital when they received bad news. She would cry to console others, but nobody, not Grandpa, not her daughter, nor any of my uncles or Grandma's siblings, ever remembered her crying for herself. My grandma was sobbing uncontrollably. Grandpa, a retired steelworker, former Marine sergeant, and Korean War combat veteran, physically grabbed Ass Pastor and escorted him out of their house, not too gently. Contrary to everyone's expectations, Grandma lived another 6 months, mostly because of sheer force of will. Eventually, though, Grandma passed away, and we held her memorial service at the funeral home, not Big White Church. Pompous pastor and ass pastor were conspicuously absent. In fact, there were no professional Christians from Big White Church at the service at all, not even in the audience. To start the service, Grandpa stood up at the podium in front of the crowd and said, "Some of you may have heard that I disinvited pompous pastor and ass pastor from this funeral service. This service is not an appropriate place for me to give you my reasons for doing this, although you all know me, and so you know that my reasons are good ones. Also, my wife asked me to exclude them. This funeral service may be different from other funerals that you have attended. It is going to be an open microphone funeral. Everyone who wants to say something is invited to come up here and describe your friendship with my wife. Tell a story about her that is worth remembering, or anything else that you want to say that will honor her memory and bring comfort to everyone here today." There were about 100 people at the funeral service. At least a third of them eventually stepped up to the microphone. The service, which we had planned to last about 30 minutes, lasted for over 2 hours, and as best I can tell, not one person left early. There was laughing, crying, and hugging. 3 of her grandchildren played some of her favorite songs on the piano and guitar. We all joined hands and sang her favorite hymns. Afterwards, dozens of people told my grandpa that it was one of the most comforting and uplifting funerals they had ever attended. More than a few remarked that funerals are better without preachers anyway.